Something to think about, huh? I was thinking about the word journey, and I want to ask you a question this morning. When I say the word journey, what is it that you think about? Now, I think maybe growing up in Australia, it wrecked my ability to have a good thought association when it came to the word journey, because when I think of the word journey, sometimes I think of a very long, very stretched out road with very few turns and very little change of scenery. And it looks a little bit like this up on the screen. There's a place in Australia called the Nullarbor, and if you look at the bottom part, it's a very light brown. See the light brown? That's the Great Australian Bight. And the longest piece of straight road there is about 1,100 kilometres. And so, you know, if you're traveling at 100 kilometres an hour, you've got about 11 hours of exactly the same thing. And so when you think about journey, maybe it's because I traveled that road as a kid. It just wrecked my perception of what a journey might look like. But it doesn't happen in New Zealand, guys. Every 5 minutes, the scenery changes. It's a very rich, beautiful country when it comes to scenery. But growing up now and being an adult, I think I associate the word journey more with, you hear people say things like, I'll do the journey with you. And you sort of start to think, well, maybe the journey isn't a landscape. It's not a geographic thing. Maybe the journey is the community, who you're doing it with. You know, maybe the journey isn't a long, drawn, straight road with very few things to look at. Maybe it's really potholed and twisted, and there's signs along the way, and sometimes there's multiple lanes, and other times there's just this one lane and it's just a one-way track. But the journey has a little bit more of a varied association in my mind now. So I wonder, what does the journey look like for you? Because if we use the word journey and we say things like, I'm going to journey with Jesus, then that implies that there has to be part of our track, part of our road that walks with him. Part of our journey would be in association with him if we're going to journey with Jesus. And so then that sort of springboarded me into this idea of, actually, that feels more like a collision. That feels more like something that's an event that kind of happens where your journeys collide. Like today. We're all in this room. We're all very different. Maybe our weeks have been a journey. Let's say our weeks have been a journey just for the sake of today. And in this space and in this time, at this very moment, here in this room, we all collide. Our journeys are not like long stretched out roads in this moment. They're a gathering in this space. We share an experience in this place today. We gather in rooms throughout our lives, and we associate ourselves with things. We associate ourselves with institutions or groups or politics or beliefs, and we go on a journey together. We've shared experiences as the things that unite us, our common thread. In this room today, we could have gathered because we have this common need for community. We've probably gathered because we either really believe in God or we're very, very curious about him and want to know more. We might just need to be in touch with people, but whatever it is our common need has us sharing this experience where our journeys now collide. This weekend is a really good example of that because it's Waitangi weekend. You know, there's this common banner that this is what this weekend is about, but there's multiple interpretations about how that should be seen and what that means. And some people just take it as the holiday, and other people it's a very political thing, and other people it's a very heart, tribe, who I am thing. Waitangi weekend is an example of how our journeys can collide. This last week in the USA, we've seen footage on our TVs of people gathering in airports for a common reason, either to protest or to unite, something that they are seeing as an issue. Their journeys, no matter how diverse they are as people, their journeys are colliding this week. So because we're humans and we kind of understand humans, there's a couple of things that we can know for sure when it comes to what exists in a room when there's a collision point. Because collisions are not neat and tidy. If you think about that word, collisions often come with a bit of mess. They come with a bit of collateral damage. So present in this experience, we bring with us our own culture, our understanding of propriety, what's right, what's wrong, our history, our story, the lens through which we see the world, our experience with this God who we gather in the name of, our motive of why we come, our version of the truth, our preferences of, for example, for today, of what we would like to sing or what we would like to hear, our need for what we need to leave the room with today, our expectation, our hope that I would leave maybe with this, or that I would experience maybe this. And that's just today. That's just today. And we do multiple experiences of this throughout our lives. There's a story in the Bible of collision that I want us to look at today. Let's read it. It's on page 634 if you're getting Bible from the pew in front of you, and it will be on the screen. I'm going to start sort of in the middle of the story. That's where we're going to begin reading. You might want to grab the Bible if that's a bit too small for you to read. It's always good to have it in your hand and in front of you as well. This is Luke 23, starting at verse 39, and we'll go to verse 43, just a few verses here this morning. It says this: one of the criminals hanging beside him scoffed. "So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself and us too while you're at it." But the other criminal protested, "Don't you fear God, even when you've been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes, but this man hasn't done anything wrong." And then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now, if you feel like we just started reading in the middle of a story, you would be absolutely right. We just started right in the middle of something, in the middle of a collision. So let's rewind for a second. Not too long before this exchange, there was a gathering in a courtyard, a collision in a courtyard. And in that courtyard, there was a whole lot of diversity. There were three characters, the three characters that we just read about, Jesus and these two criminals. Now, for the sake of today, I'm going to get really creative and I'm going to give these criminals names. They're going to be called Criminal 1 and Criminal 2. I'm being creative because if I gave them names and it was somebody's name in the room, I would just feel really stink about that. So we've got Criminal 1 and we've got Criminal 2 and we've got Jesus. There are some other players in this courtyard right now. There's a guy named Pilate. There's a whole crowd of crazy, diverse people. There are Jesus followers in that crowd, and then there's a whole lot of haters in that crowd. There are soldiers, and who else? I don't know. You know, there's probably a whole bunch of people there, but let's just name those groups for now. And the Bible mentions there's also this other one guy. His name is Barabbas. Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a convicted criminal. He was a bad guy. And he was a problem for society. In fact, he was such a problem for society that he'd already been tried and convicted, and it was proven, and he was on death row. He was supposed to be dying that day. And so what's happening in this courtyard with all of these diverse people, not unsimilar to the diversity that's in the room today, is that Pilate standing there and the crowd saying, "Crucify Jesus." And he's saying why? He didn't do anything wrong. So he sends them back to somebody else. And then they come back and they're like, "Crucify Jesus." And in the end, Pilate says, "Listen, this guy, I can't see anything wrong with this guy. But if you want him to die, how much do you want him to die? I mean, here's the bad guy. Here's the convicted criminal. Do you want him to die or do you want Jesus to die?" And the crowd's crying out, "Crucify Jesus, crucify him." So in the end, Pilate's like, "Okay, well, if you want him dead that much that you're going to let the bad guy go, then we'll kill Jesus." And so then Jesus is in Barabbas's place. So that's what's going on in the crowd that day. The crowd wanted Jesus dead so much. Now, with that many people, there's this collision in the crowd, and we know human nature. We know it. So here's what we can safely know. There are big, fat agendas that are present in the crowd that day. There are people there that are political, and they are lobbying, and they are protesting, and they are picket liners. And they're in the crowd that day. There is popularity at play in the crowd that day. Who's our favorite? Who's the flavor of the month? There are interested but uninvested spectators in the crowd that day, people that have just come along for a little look. And then there are people that probably loved the victims, that are on death row. And they're in the crowd that day, wondering whether to speak or whether to stay silent because they don't want to have to die as well. And they're doing everything they can just to contain their grief. There's a whole lot of people in the crowd that day. Does it sound familiar? Not unlike any gathering that we're ever a part of. There are people that are there that day because Jesus was a threat to them. And do you know, he wasn't a threat to their lives, really. He was a threat to their ideas. He was a threat to their beliefs. He was a threat to their lifestyles and their political stance and everything that they thought was correct. He was a threat to the law. And he was messing people up as a threat to those things. And they were very uncomfortable. So uncomfortable that they were willing to trade the guilt of Barabbas for the innocence of Jesus. And I guess it got me wondering, church, about how often we can get stuck in our own agendas, that we trade in guilt and we feign innocence. How often that we can get so stuck in freeing ourselves to a certain extent, or not comfortable, just uncomfortable enough, that I'm just going to step back and fade into the background while the innocent person takes the rap for this thing that I might be a little bit guilty for. It's an interesting mix of people in the crowd that day. So let's fast forward again to the verses that we just read, to this exchange on the cross. The patchwork crowd is there now. They've moved from the courtyard and they're all at the cross. And they've journeyed with Jesus to this point. Their lives have walked with his, even just for a few moments, some of them. The soldiers are there, and then there's criminal 1 and criminal 2. And Jesus is hanging there, he's already taken the place of Barabbas. I don't know why, but that just got me this week. When I was thinking about that, I was thinking, yeah, I know that Jesus took our place on the cross. You know how some of us have grown up in church, and so we hear, Jesus has taken our place on the cross. Jesus had taken our place before he even got to the cross. When he exchanged his life for Barabbas' life, I just was like, as he was walking to the cross, he had already taken the place of someone else. And I just thought that was a profound moment, that even in walking there, he had already done a big exchange on our behalf. And there he is, our Jesus. He's naked, he's vulnerable, and he's engaging in this death row conversation with a couple of criminals who had actually earned their way to the cross. So let's think about criminal 1. I just want to focus on criminal 1, that guy. Criminal 1, he's kind of giving away, and what he says to Jesus in those verses, he's giving away his theology a little bit. He thinks Jesus is a bit like Santa Claus. He thinks Jesus is, if you take care of freeing you, then you can also free me. I'm just going to ride on the coattails of your miracle here, Jesus. So he's got this Santa Claus theology, and he's wanting to be rescued. He needs a rescue, but not so he could live differently, just so he could get out of the consequence of how he has lived. So he wants a rescue, and he's self-seeking, and he's interested not in Jesus, but in his own survival. And it's interesting to think about this, because I think anytime we get interested in our own survival more than we're interested in anything else, we instantly walk into sin in that moment. We're instantly going to do everything we can just to survive. It's natural, it's instinctive for us. It's counter-cultural to go the other way. And so he's challenging Jesus, and he's saying, prove who you are, but not so my life can be changed, just so I can get out of this situation. So in this situation, criminal 1 is focused on his own suffering. So the easiest way to put this in a consumer mentality is that he believes that God is an extra. God is extra to everything else. He actually has everything that he needs. He's all good as long as he can get out of this situation. And God can help him get there, then I'm going to get him to get me there, you know? So that's his mentality. Let's have a look at criminal 2. Criminal 2's theology, we're told in Bible commentaries that criminal 2 has most likely, through the language that he uses in these verses, has encountered Jesus before. He recognizes him. And it's kind of given away because he says, don't you fear God, which means he identifies Jesus as God. And then he talks about the kingdom of God. And so his interactions with Jesus have happened beforehand. We don't know how life-changing or life-altering they've been up until this point, because here he is hanging on a cross for his crimes, his legitimate crimes, but he recognizes that Jesus is the real deal. And he's recognizing also that he's deserving of his punishment. And he's accepting that consequence. And he's self-condemning to a certain extent. He's like, hey, listen, if you could remember me. But he's not demanding anything. And he's not asking Jesus to prove anything. He's kind of going, I am the scum of the earth, but if you could just remember me. And he's dying to self, and he's calling Jesus blameless. So he in that action is surrendering, and he's requesting, remember me, remember me. I know I don't deserve it, but in that moment he's there, and he recognizes that I deserve to be here, and he doesn't. And grace just messes him up, because grace does that. When we collide with grace, that's a messy collision. And it messes him up enough for him to go, ooh, if you could just remember me. I don't deserve it, but if you could remember me. And so in this crucifixion, he's not focused on his own suffering, he's focused on his own dying. He realizes that he's got to let go of his life, really, in order to actually have one. There are also the believers in the crowd that day, and I wonder if they were having a similar conversation to criminal too, recognizing their own mess, and because of Jesus' innocence, thinking about the injustice of the collision that day. See, diversity that day in that crowd collides under a common event of Jesus' crucifixion. That's what they all have in common. They are all witnessing this crucifixion, this conversation. Everybody's individual stories led them to this one point that day, this intersection. Whether they liked it or not, whether they believe in him or not, whether they experience him or not, whether they're indifferent or not. All of their stories, all of their suffering, all of their experiences individually have led them to this one intersection. They are a man or a woman or an activist or a pacifist. They could have been a celebrity or a common person. They might have been powerful or powerless. They could have been rich, poor, or middle class. It doesn't matter. Gay, straight, believer, non-believer, criminal, upstanding citizen. They are all there. And what are they going to do with this experience? Because I think it's safe to say that they're never, ever, ever going to be the same again after this. I don't know about you, but sometimes if I've been in a conflict or a tense situation where someone might be accusing me of something, or we might be disagreeing, the first thing I'm often looking for is vindication, is a way out of that, is a way to feel better about that. Sometimes I even look for people to try and jump onto my side because that's how much I want vindication. How can I get this thing off me? Am I really who that person sees me as? Do I really need to own any of this that they're saying about me? And those are the questions that I ask if I'm in a healthy frame of mind, if I'm doing good about myself. If I'm not in a healthy frame of mind, and if I'm not feeling good about myself, the chances are I'm going to do everything I can not to ask myself any questions at all, because I don't want to think about it, because I don't want to think that maybe I have something to blame. There's part of me that is to blame for whatever uncomfortable situation I'm in. So I just simply refuse to ask myself those questions. But sometimes it's not the difference between am I guilty of something or not, but a question of what am I guilty of? What part of this can I own? Which guilty person am I? And as I read this story and as I hear it again, because I grew up hearing this story, I have to ask myself the question, who am I on that day? We've looked at the crowd, we know who's there. If you've grown up with this story or not, I guess what I'm wondering is whether or not you could ask yourself the question, which guilty person am I? Who am I on that day? Am I Barabbas? Am I looking just to get away with it and trade my guilt for somebody else's innocence? Is that what I'm looking to do? And then I can just celebrate and get on with it? Am I in the crowd that day? Maybe I'm in the crowd and I'm perpetuating injustice, but I'm not guilty enough to hang, but I'm guilty of something. Am I a political activist who's entirely sure that my view is absolutely, without a doubt, the right one? Am I jeering and loud and making my views known? Or am I a quiet believer just trying to fade into the background that day, just to survive, just to deal with what I'm witnessing that I can't stomach, that I can't deal with? Am I criminal number one? Always searching. Prove it to me. Give it to me. Give me what I need my favorite thing. And I'm always trying to mold things to suit my needs. Am I the consumer that's just needing to see what I might gain from this Jesus, and then maybe I'll choose to believe in him? Am I criminal number two? Recognizing that I tried it on my own, and look where it got me. To hang beside criminal one, who's as guilty as I am. And maybe I'm realizing that my way, my own stuff, it actually just doesn't cut it anymore. We may share common traits with any number of those people. And we don't ask ourselves these questions in order to condemn ourselves, but just to be real, just for a second, about which guilty person am I? Paul is a convert of Jesus. He used to be a Christian killer. Safe to say that he might have identified with the criminal on the cross or the soldiers that day. He was the guy that was stringing people up because they believed in Jesus. He might have been the person in the crowd shouting, "Crucify him," until he came face to face with the reality of an innocent Jesus. And grace messed him up in that moment, the way it did for criminal too. And he puts it this way. He puts it this way, church. In Galatians 17 verse 20, he says, "My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me." Now that passage there and the 3 or 4 verses surrounding it is just another sermon in its entirety. And when you start to read that and think about that, that just could explode. We could just go so many places with this statement today. But today I just want to drop it in there. Because if anybody knew what it was like to ask the question, which guilty person am I? It was Paul, and he has this amazing realization. You see, Paul had come to understand a couple of big things. He understands that there's another kind of collision going on the cross that day. There's a meeting of the old law and the new law. There's this embodiment of the covenant taking place that day. Judgment is going on. All of these words, I'm saying them and I'm dropping them in there, but they can have this polarizing response. Like, we don't know, really, are we going to talk about judgment? Oh, really, are we going to talk about the covenant? What's that? I know that each of these words has these rich definitions and this content. Some people love to talk about the law. Some people are scared to. Some people love to think about judgment. Others fear it with everything that's in them, because at their heart of hearts, they still believe that maybe it's about them being good enough and they don't quite know what to do with the word judgment. But make no mistake, we know what Paul knew when he made this bold and beautiful statement. Judgment's happening for the crowd, the criminals and the soldiers. They're being judged, but guess who's being judged? Jesus. The law is present, but guess where it is? On Jesus. Jesus is taking the rap for every crime that day, for every guilty person. Jesus is owning everything that anyone in that crowd might confess that they needed to own for themselves. And Paul, in this statement, is literally putting himself up on the cross next to Jesus, because he knows that in that act, that all of his sin and all of the expectation requirement of the law and all of his fault is laid to rest in that moment. He realizes that he's in debt to Jesus, but not for justice, but for the mercy that he's about to receive. And in this act, he finds purpose and meaning, and he can live in freedom unlike anybody else you've ever seen that's been a convert of Jesus Christ. He's changed. Paul and the second criminal number 2, have both come to this same conclusion. He says to Jesus, "Remember me. If you could, Jesus, I know I don't deserve it, but remember me." There's such power in this word. There's such power in this language. And just to give you a little bit of context, this word remember in the New Testament, it's Greek word, but the Greek word was actually translated from a Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word is the Old Testament word, zakah. This is covenant language. This is the language Jesus starts using with his people from the very beginning in Genesis when he starts talking about relationship that he wants to have with us. This is promise language. This is, I will be your God and you will be my people. Do you know this is used for 148 times? 148 times is this word remember, with that much meaning and that much relational value and that much depth. That's how often Jesus wants us to know that he will be our God and we will be his people. And the man, criminal number 2, in that moment saying, remember me, could be saying, I will be your people because you will be my God. I want to claim that relationship that you set out since Genesis. I want to be that guy who claims the covenant promise with you, God. So I was wondering what Paul might suggest if he were here today. What would be the safest place to be in that collision that day? And I'm wondering whether or not Paul might suggest that the safest place for us to be is the really counterintuitive one, the one that makes the least amount of sense. The person to choose in terms of which guilty person am I might be criminal number 2. So which guilty person am I? And then there's Jesus, the Christ. The condition of Jesus in that moment. He's unjustly tried and convicted. He's got the least amount of dignity any other human being could ever have. He's most vulnerable. He's naked. He's hurting. He's struggling to breathe. He's actually feeling forsaken by his own God, his own dad. He's feeling like all of this time that I felt like we were in this together, I feel like we're separated from each other now. So he's having that moment and he's listening to a crowd jeer and mock him and soldiers gamble for his robes and criminal number 1 saying, prove it, prove that you're Jesus, you know? And criminal 2 in that same moment is then saying, hey, I don't deserve it, but could you remember me? Like all of this is going on in this collision with Jesus. He's in this moment and he's alone. He feels so alone and he's holding the weight of all of it. And he's praying to his dad and he's offering hope even in his own suffering. And he's listening and he's reassuring and he's answering questions. And I love to process this with a whiteboard. And so, you know, when I talk to you about the crowd and we had, you know, the crowd and the political activists and we had the soldiers and we had Pilate and we have Barabbas and we have criminal 1 and we have criminal 2. It's like, what is Jesus saying to each of these people? What's his answer to each of these people that day? Because he does respond to them. He does respond to them. His answer to the crowd can be found in the verses in the story. And he says these words. He says, and the crowd, remember, these are the politics. These are the political people and the popular people and the power play people. And his answer to them is so beautiful. He says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. They think they know what they're doing. In their ignorance, even if it's this well-meaning passion that they have, forgive them. Even if they think they're standing for justice, forgive them. Even if they're doing it in the name of me, please just forgive them, because it's not, you know, forgive their arrogance, forgive their ignorance, forgive all the things that they think that they know that they don't. Father, please just forgive them. The crowd and the soldiers that day, they walked away forgiven because of that prayer that Jesus said on the cross that day for them. His answer to criminal number 1, this one was interesting, was just a lot of silence. He didn't say anything back to him, not that's recorded in the Bible. But the answer, I think, to this guy was to keep hanging there and to keep owning his stuff and to possibly be praying, God, just help him to see me for who I really am. God, just help him to let go of himself. Like just to, you know, his answer was silence, but it's still an answer. His answer to criminal 2, who was the surrender guy and the worship guy, because in the moment that he elevated Jesus, that was his act of worship. His answer to him was to give him immediate hope. Today you'll be with me in paradise. And to give him immediate rest. I've got this. I've got this for you. I'll take it. And then you know what? I didn't see it until about 5 minutes before I got up the front this morning. But Jesus answered the world in that moment as well. Because he uttered the words, "It is finished." Which meant all that judgment and all of that expectation, I just dealt to it. I just owned it. It is finished. He was filled with answers. He didn't say much, but he was filled with answers on the cross that day. And I just want to end with this thought. Something that we can learn from criminal 2, possibly Paul. His peace came when he received the grace of Jesus Christ. The gospel became real to him in the darkest time of his life. Jesus' ultimate act of grace, what Christians call the gospel, actually became real the night the world went completely black. And do you know that night the world did go completely black? There was darkness. The gospel is real most in the darkness. So before we forget, church, that we need to tidy up our lives and we need to walk out of here as bright beaming lights to the world, that's not us anyway. That's the power of God in us. And the gospel isn't real to us unless we're real about our darkness. Let's think about a collision. All of these things that those criminals had to deal with and that crowd has to deal with, they're painful things. Now, I don't want to make it seem like being a Christian is not a joy. It is. But the joy is real because we've dealt with the darkness, because we've dealt with the pain. The joy is fake unless we're aware of that. Light is not light unless it invades darkness. Darkness has to exist for light to come through. The truth is we've all experienced darkness, and we do. We try not to permanently live there. We don't want to be the Debbie Downer, that walks out and is always bad. It's always bad and I'm such a bad person. It's not about us being self-deprecating. It's not about us not being able to contain joy. But forgiveness is real when it's freeing us from our shame. So for forgiveness to be real, we need to be aware of our shame. Humility becomes powerful in the moment that it's overpowering our pride. So for humility to exist, we need to be aware of our pride. Truth is more relevant when it rises up from the denial in our lives and it overpowers it. The gospel does what nothing else can do, and it cuts through our stuff. And it comes riding into our dark places, humble and naked and suffering. And we often think, well, that's just a cop-out. People can just do whatever they want then, and then they can just say, oh, well, Jesus is covering it. No, that's not what this kind of grace is. This is not cheap. This is expensive. This is not weak. This is strong. This arrests us. This is all-consuming. These are painful experiences only so they can bring more joy. I don't know about you, but I think it's very easy to turn into criminal 1 and be all about my safety, be all about my control. I try to control my actions. I try to control my responses. I try to control my finances. I try to control what you think of me. I try to manipulate situations so I've got it. I'm in control. I'm okay. And that the world would see the most together version of me that they could possibly see. I'm thinking that we're humans, so we're a bit alike like that. But my God invites me to be countercultural. Just when I think that the safest place is gaining control, he says, let me just show you how safe surrender is. Lose some control. Could it be that the safest place that day that this happened was on the cross next to Jesus, saying the words of criminal 2, naked and vulnerable and colliding with Jesus? If you could just remember me. If you could just remember me. Could it be that our healing is not in the absence of our pain, but in the acknowledgement of it? And that our deepest peace is not in the absence of our conflict, but in the middle of it. In the presence of God. In the presence of God. So what's stopping you today from becoming criminal 2? What are you trying to save yourself from? Because we're very quick to switch to criminal number 1 and be all about our survival, and that's natural. That's natural. We all do that. We all try to save ourselves. But what's become political for you rather than a passion? What's become a question of popularity or power? What's become a matter of pride and control in our lives? Is it the perception of me? Is it the success of me? Is it the vulnerability of me? And I just wonder, church, whether or not you would like to bring your darkness to a meaningful collision this morning. And if you're hesitating because you're a mess, I'd like you to know today that Jesus is not afraid of mess. He died for it. And it's already forgiven because he already died. The messy, the broken, the damaged, the prideful, the unbelieving, the selfish, the needy parts of you that you feel like you need to save yourself from. I want to know today if you want to bring them to Jesus. Because the paradox of the journey is that the peace and the healing and the steadiness actually lies in our death to self and life in the power of Jesus Christ. I'm going to invite William up. He's going to sing a song for us today. And it's a song of commitment. And it's a song of surrender. And I don't like to prescribe how this needs to take place in a room because the room's messy. Because we're all in it. And we all have mess. And we all have a different need. We came with it today. And I guess I want to offer you the opportunity to respond how you need to respond. If you want somebody to pray with you, we'd love to pray with you. If you would like to come to the front and just surrender some things this morning, you are always welcome to do that. You are not alone. We are messy people and we are okay with that. But as William sings today, I just pray that you're having your own conversation with the Lord. That sounds a little bit like his conversation in this song. Let's listen together. That sounds like joy, doesn't it? That sounds like joy. And church, when we really get that, and we need to do it more than once in our lives, I think Paul says we need to come and we need to die daily. We need to come to that cross and we need to acknowledge every single day, that's right, which guilty person am I? That's right, Jesus, remember me please if you just could. And I just know that in a room like us, there's things today that we need to exchange. There's politics and there's popularity and there's power that we need to take and we need to place on the cross. And we need to live in the freedom that Jesus bought us when he owned all of that. So if you have something that you would like to exchange today, I want to pray for you. I'm just going to invite everybody in the room to stand. And if you're in the room and you're standing and you want me to pray specifically for you, specifically for something that you want to trade in at the cross today, I'm going to just invite you to come and walk forward with these brave ladies that did that today. You don't have to be shy about this. We all have mess, but I'd like to just pray specifically for you if that's what you need. And then if you're in your seat and you would just like to offer your life to Jesus again today, he knows your heart. I don't think you have to do action for him to know your heart, but sometimes our body can respond in a way that just opens us up to the Spirit. So I'd invite you just to open your hands and just say, Jesus, this is me. I'm coming back to the cross. I'm criminal too. I need you to remember me today. I need you to remember me today, and let's pray together. God, we're in this room today, and it's a collision. It's an event. It's a collision of all of our journeys, as varied as they are. And we come and we just allow your Holy Spirit access. And we think about this story that most of us know quite well. It's the reason we're in church in the first place. And we recognize our mess and our brokenness. And we realize that that's beautiful because that's why we need you. That's why we press into you, because we need you, because we're messy. And we can't do it ourselves, and we're sick of trying to rescue ourselves. And we're sick of trying to control our own lives enough that we can just try and escape the consequences of our stuff, God. We don't want to escape it. We want to give it to you. We need you to own it. The thief said, remember me. God, today we say, please remember us. Remember us in covenant. Remember us in love. Remember us in relationship. You be our God, and we'll be your people. Because you gave that to us, and we say yes. Remember us. You be our God. We'll be your people. God, if we're crucified with you today, we live in a joy that we never knew. not free of our consequences, not free of our mess, but free in Jesus Christ, who owned all of that, who covers us with mercy, who will walk with us through it all and to the end. God, we just want to claim that freedom. We live because you died. And now we live in you, Jesus. And that's a hard thing for us to wrap our heads around, but it's so simple. It's so simple. So we say yes, and we just exchange all of our power and politics and popularity, and we just ask and we accept the peace. We accept the peace. And for these people gathered in the front, Lord, pour into them all that they need in order for them to live fully and embodied in that peace today. And for the people in the room with their hands open, Lord, see them, remember them. May they renew their commitment to you today. And for those of us, Lord, that are struggling, just cut through the struggle. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Let's live in peace and freedom. And if you would like specific prayer today, I think it's a good day for it. So please don't go far. There'll be some people around and we'll pray for you. We'd love to do that. All right. Bless you.
Come on, if you love Jesus, why don't you make some noise one more time? Come on.